The periscope crosshairs sliced through the gray mist of the Sea of Okhotsk, locking onto a target that shouldn't have existed in a submariner's world. It was July 19, 1945. The water outside the hull of the USS Barb was dangerously cold, hovering just above freezing. But inside the conning tower, the air was thick with the heat of machinery and the smell of diesel and sweat. Commander Eugene Fluckey, a man his crew called Lucky Fluckey, not because he avoided danger, but because he actively courted it and survived, pressed his eye against the rubber eyepiece. He wasn't looking at a battleship. He wasn't tracking a destroyer or a merchant tanker. He was watching a steam locomotive. The train was snaking along the rugged coastline of Karafuto, the southern half of Sakhalin Island, puffing black smoke against the green mountains. It was hauling flat cars piled high with military trucks, ammunition crates, and uniformed soldiers. To Fluckey, it was more than just a target. It was an insult. The Japanese were using the coastline as a highway, brazenly moving reinforcements to prepare for the inevitable American invasion, convinced that the sea offered them protection because no warship could get close enough to strike without running aground. They believed they were safe. They didn't know the USS Barb was watching. For 3 weeks, the Barb had been terrorizing the northern rim of the Japanese Empire, operating in waters so shallow and uncharted that other commanders would have considered them suicidal. But the Pacific War was entering its final, brutal phase, and the ocean was empty. The mighty Imperial Japanese Navy lay at the bottom of the sea. The merchant convoys that had once fed the island nation had been strangled into non-existence by American wolf packs. For a hunter like Fluckey, this was a crisis of opportunity. There was simply nothing left to sink. He had already revolutionized submarine warfare during this patrol by doing the unthinkable, mounting a rocket launcher on the deck of his boat. It was a jury-rigged contraption, a Mark 51 launcher originally designed for landing craft, bolted onto the Barb's forward deck at Fluckey's insistence. He had turned his submarine into a surfacing artillery battery, raining 5-inch spin-stabilized rockets onto coastal factories, paper mills, and shipyards in towns like Shari and Shikuka. He had watched through his binoculars as Japanese towns burned, the first time in history a submarine had launched ballistic rockets against shore targets. But rockets were imprecise weapons of terror. They caused chaos, but they couldn't guarantee the destruction of a specific moving object. As Fluckey watched that train disappear around a bend, the gears in his mind began to grind against the problem. He didn't just want to shell the tracks with his deck gun. The Japanese engineering crews would repair a hole in the rail line in hours. He wanted to kill the train. He wanted to derail the locomotive, pile the cars into a burning heap, and send a message to Tokyo that nowhere, not even their own soil, was safe. The problem was mechanical. Submarines carry torpedoes designed to break the keels of ships, and deck guns designed to hole hulls. They do not carry anti-tank mines or demolition charges for moving locomotives. Fluckey withdrew the periscope and descended into the boat, gathering his officers. The mood aboard the Barb was a strange mix of exhaustion and adrenaline. They were thousands of miles from base, operating on the very doorstep of Japan, and their captain was asking them to solve a physics puzzle that sounded like a riddle. How do you blow up a train with a submarine? The solution came from the most unlikely place, the memories of a childhood prank. Billy Hatfield, an electrician's mate 3rd class, had worked for the railroads back in the States before the war. As the crew brainstormed in the cramped forward torpedo room, Hatfield spoke up. He remembered how, as a boy, he used to crack walnuts by placing them between the railroad tie and the rail. When the train passed over, the immense weight of the locomotive would bow the steel rail down just enough to crush the nut against the wood. It was a matter of fractions of an inch, but it was a predictable, unstoppable force. Hatfield sketched his idea on a piece of paper. They didn't need a complex timer or a remote detonator. They needed a microswitch. If they could bury a pressure switch beneath the rail, the weight of the Japanese locomotive itself would complete the circuit. The train would commit suicide. The crew set to work with the feverish intensity of men who knew they were making history. They scavenged a microswitch from the ship's internal systems. They wired 3 dry-cell batteries in series to provide the spark. For the explosive payload, they took a 55-pound scuttling charge, a massive canister of high explosives intended to blow the submarine apart in case of capture, and rigged it to the detonator. The entire assembly was crude, dangerous, and brilliant. To waterproof the electronics, they shoved the batteries and the switch mechanism into an empty pickle jar taken from the galley. It was the ultimate improvisation, a weapon of war constructed from spare parts and kitchen refuse. But building the bomb was the easy part. Delivering it was the nightmare. The railroad tracks lay 400 yards inland, across a hostile beach, through scrub brush and drainage ditches, in territory patrolled by Japanese soldiers and reputed to be guarded by dogs. This wasn't a job for a torpedo. It was a job for a landing party. Fluckey was proposing a ground invasion of the Japanese home islands launched from a submarine. He announced the mission to the crew, expecting hesitation. Instead, he got a riot. Virtually every one of the 80 men aboard the Barb volunteered. They clamored for a spot on the rubber rafts, arguing their cases with desperate enthusiasm. Fluckey had to establish brutal criteria to whittle down the list. First, and non-negotiable, no married men. He would not be responsible for making widows on a mission this high risk. Second, a mix of specialists. He needed gunners, sturdy oarsmen, and, crucially, Hatfield to wire the device. Third, he wanted Boy Scouts. It sounded absurd in a briefing for a commando raid, but Fluckey, an Eagle Scout himself, knew that scouts were trained in pathfinding, night navigation, and first aid. If the team got separated in the dark or lost in the marshes, those skills would be the difference between capture and survival. 8 men were chosen. Chief Gunner's mate Paul Saunders was tapped to lead the squad. He was a veteran of the Barb, a man who had seen every terrifying minute of her war patrols. With him were Hatfield, Francis Sever, Lawrence Newland, Edward Klingelsmith, James Richard, John Marcus, and Lieutenant William Walker. They were a motley collection of sailors, cooks, and electricians, suddenly transformed into elite commandos. The preparations were intense. The boat's engineers torched steel plating off the engine room floor and bent it into crude shovels and picks, welding handles on them so the men could dig into the rocky ballast of the railroad bed. They blackened their faces with grease and soot. They strapped .45 caliber pistols to their hips and packed carbines. They studied the coastline through the periscope for 3 agonizing days, waiting for the weather to cooperate. Fluckey needed cloud cover to hide the moon. Clear skies would silhouette the surfaced submarine against the water, making her an easy target for coastal artillery or patrol planes. For 3 nights, the moon mocked them, shining brightly over Karafuto. The tension in the boat was palpable. They were running out of time on their patrol endurance. If the clouds didn't roll in soon, they would have to leave with the train still running. On the night of July 22nd, the sky finally granted them their cover. Heavy stratus clouds rolled in from the west, capping the mountain peaks and plunging the coastline into an abyssal darkness. Fluckey gave the order. The Barb crept toward the shore, her electric motors humming barely above a whisper. The water grew dangerously shallow. The fathometer read 6 fathoms, 36 feet. The Barb was a fleet submarine, over 300 feet long. In water this shallow, if she had to crash dive to escape an attack, she would smash her keel into the seabed before her conning tower went under. Fluckey was betting the lives of his entire crew on silence and darkness. He brought the boat to within 950 yards of the breakers. The silhouette of the land was a jagged black line against a charcoal sky. The smell of pine trees and damp earth drifted over the water, a scent that felt alien to men who had breathed recycled air and diesel fumes for months. It was the smell of the enemy. The command came to launch. The two inflatable rafts were hauled up through the hatches and inflated on the wet steel deck. The 8 men climbed in, checking their gear one last time. The Pickle Jar bomb was cradled like a newborn baby. Fluckey leaned over the bridge railing, his voice a low rasp in the darkness. He told them to paddle like hell, plant the device, and get back. He told them he would wait as long as he could, but if the Japanese destroyers showed up, he would have to dive. They all knew what that meant. If the Barb dove, the 8 men on the beach were dead men. They would be stranded in hostile territory with nothing but pistols and a shovel. The rafts pushed off, the black water lapping against the rubber sides. The shore party paddled in silence, the rhythm of their strokes the only sound in the void. From the bridge, Fluckey watched them disappear into the gloom, checking his watch. The clock was running. They had 3 hours of darkness before the moon might break through or the dawn would expose them. The landing was sloppy but effective. The rafts ground onto the gravel beach with a wet crunch. The men spilled out, hauling the boats up past the high tide line and hiding them among the driftwood. They were the first American combat troops to set foot on the Japanese home islands in the war, invading a superpower with nothing more than a rubber boat and a homemade bomb. Saunders split the team. 2 men stayed with the rafts to guard the escape route and signal the submarine with a blue flashlight if trouble approached. The other 6 moved inland. The terrain was a nightmare of tall, razor-sharp grass and waist-deep drainage ditches filled with stagnant water. They stumbled through the dark, soaking wet, freezing, and hopped up on adrenaline. Every rustle of the wind sounded like a patrol. Every shadow looked like a guard dog. They crossed a coastal highway, freezing as they scanned for headlights, and scrambled up the embankment of the railroad tracks. They had reached the objective. The tracks stretched out north and south, disappearing into the blackness. But before they could start digging, the ground began to tremble. It started as a vibration in the soles of their boots, then grew into a rhythmic thrumming. A train was coming. The men dove into the brush on the side of the embankment, pressing their faces into the dirt. Hatfield clutched the explosive charge to his chest, praying the vibration wouldn't trigger the detonator prematurely. The locomotive roared out of the night, a towering black monster of steel and steam. It was running without headlights, observing blackout regulations, which meant the engineer couldn't see the 6 Americans lying mere feet from the spinning drive wheels. The train thundered past, a blur of noise and heat, trailing a string of freight cars. The wind from its passage whipped their clothes. As the caboose faded into the distance, Saunders realized the terrifying truth. The rail line was far busier than they had estimated. They didn't have hours to dig. They might only have minutes. They leaped onto the tracks. Hatfield chose a spot between 2 ties and marked it. "Dig here," he whispered. Marcus and the others swung their improvised shovels, striking the ballast. Clang! The sound rang out like a gunshot in the silent night. The roadbed wasn't soft gravel. It was compacted rock and frozen earth. The steel shovels scraped and sparked. They froze, waiting for a shout, a gunshot, a siren. Nothing. They kept digging, using their hands to muffle the sound, tearing at the stones with bleeding fingers. They needed a hole big enough for the 55-pound charge and the battery jar. Hatfield worked with the precision of a surgeon in a slaughterhouse. He excavated the soil from under the rail itself, creating a cavity where the pressure switch would sit. He had to get the clearance exactly right. If the switch was too low, the bending rail wouldn't touch it. If it was too high, the switch would be crushed or jammed. He was working by the dim glow of a red-lensed flashlight, sweat dripping from his nose onto the cold steel of the rail. Suddenly, a whistle cut through the air. It wasn't a train whistle. It was one of their own sentries down the track. Another train, coming from the opposite direction. "Clear the track," Saunders hissed. They scrambled back into the drainage ditch, dragging their tools with them. This time the wait was agonizing. The digging was only half done. If the train engineer looked down, he might see the fresh earth, the disturbed gravel. The train approached slower than the first one, a heavy freight hauler laboring up the slight grade. The headlight was off, but the firebox glowed, casting a flickering orange light on the rails. The Americans held their breath, watching the wheels roll over the very spot they had just been excavating. If they had left a tool behind, if the charge had been in the hole. The train passed. The silence returned, heavier than before. They scrambled back up the bank. "Dig faster," Saunders ordered. They hacked at the ground, abandoning caution for speed. Finally, the hole was deep enough. Hatfield lowered the explosive charge. He placed the pickle jar with the batteries beside it. He ran the wires. This was the moment of truth. He was arming a bomb that was designed to be triggered by vibration and pressure, while crouching on a railroad track that vibrated every time the wind blew. He connected the leads to the microswitch. He slid a piece of cardboard between the switch contacts as a safety, then carefully positioned the switch head against the underside of the rail. He pulled the cardboard. The weapon was live. They buried it. They shoveled the gravel back over the charge, smoothing it out with their hands to make it look undisturbed. They dusted the tracks. It was invisible, a trap waiting to be sprung. Saunders checked his watch. They had been ashore too long. The window was closing. "Let's go," he whispered. They slid down the embankment and began the sprint back to the beach. They crashed through the drainage ditches, splashing water, ignoring the noise now. They reached the rafts, breathless. "Push off! Push off!" The men scrambled into the rubber boats, paddling furiously against the incoming tide. They were halfway back to the submarine when the sound started again. A low, building rumble from the north. A train was coming, and this time it was heading south, right toward the trap. From the bridge of the Barb, Commander Fluckey watched the darkness. He could see the phosphorescent wakes of the paddles struggling toward him, but he could also hear the train. He raised his megaphone, risking everything. "Paddle!" he roared into the night. "Paddle like the devil!" The train was racing the rafts. If the explosion happened before the men were aboard, the Japanese reaction would be instant. The searchlights would snap on. The coastal guns would open up on the surfaced sub. The rafts hit the side of the submarine with a thud. Men scrambled up the wet steel, hauling themselves through the hatches. The last man dropped into the conning tower. Fluckey didn't wait to deflate the rafts. He ordered them cut loose. "All ahead flank!" he yelled. The diesels roared to life, churning the water white. The Barb began to move, pulling away from the shallow grave of the coast. Fluckey stayed on the bridge, binoculars raised, watching the dark line of the shore. The train was visible now, a string of dark shapes moving against the mountains. It was rushing toward the spot where Hatfield had buried the pickle jar. The locomotive was seconds away. Fluckey held his breath, the vibration of the submarine's engines humming through his boots, waiting for the flash that would tell him if his gamble had paid off, or if they had just risked everything for a dud. The locomotive was a screaming beast of iron and steam, hurtling through the night at 40 miles per hour, its momentum carrying it inexorably toward the tiny, disturbed patch of gravel where Billy Hatfield had buried the pickle jar. On the bridge of the USS Barb, Commander Gene Fluckey gripped the railing, his knuckles white, staring across the black water. The seconds stretched into an eternity. The train engine roared past a jagged outcropping of rock, its wheels clattering rhythmically against the steel rails. Clack, 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 clack. A cadence of industrial power that drowned out the soft lap of the waves against the submarine's hull. The lead wheels of the engine, driving hard under the weight of the boiler, rolled over the wooden tie marking the grave of the explosive. The steel rail bowed downward, perhaps only a fraction of an inch, but it was enough. Inside the buried jar, the contact point of the microswitch touched the metal strip. The circuit completed. The electrons stored in the dry cell batteries surged through the wire, hitting the detonator of the 55-pound scuttling charge. The result was not a derailment. It was an annihilation. To the men watching from the deck of the Barb, it looked as if the Earth itself had decided to punch the sky. A blinding, sun-white flash erupted from beneath the locomotive, instantly vaporizing the gravel bed and shattering the night vision of everyone watching. The sound hit them a split second later, a concussive, chest-thumping crack that rolled across the water like thunder. The explosion didn't just derail the train, it threw the locomotive into the air. The massive steam boiler, compromised by the blast, ruptured instantly, adding the force of expanding superheated steam to the detonation. The engine was tossed upward like a child's toy, somersaulting amidst a fountain of dirt, fire, and twisted steel. It reached the apex of its violent flight, 200 feet in the air, a burning comet of wreckage, before crashing back down onto the tracks. The destruction was catastrophic. The freight cars behind the engine, carrying trucks, ammunition, and soldiers, slammed into the smoking crater at full speed. They jackknifed, piling onto one another in a screeching, tearing cacophony of metal. As the cars crushed together, the ammunition cargo ignited. Secondary explosions began to ripple through the wreckage, popping and flashing like strings of firecrackers thrown into a furnace. The night was no longer dark. It was lit by the hellish orange glow of the burning train, the flames reflecting off the low clouds that had hidden the submarine only moments before. "Get them below!" Fluckey roared, breaking the spell of awe that had frozen the crew. The mission was accomplished, but the danger had just spiked to its highest point. The explosion was a beacon, a flare announcing their position to every Japanese gunner within 10 miles. The men scrambled down the hatches, sliding down the ladders into the control room. Fluckey was the last man off the bridge, taking one final look at the pyre on the shore, the only time in World War II that American forces had successfully conducted a ground sabotage operation on the Japanese home islands. He dropped into the conning tower and dogged the hatch shut. "All ahead flank, rudder amidships!" The Barb's diesel engines screamed in protest as the throttles were pushed to the stops. The submarine surged forward, her bow cutting through the black water, leaving a foaming, phosphorescent wake that pointed directly back to the crime scene. They were in water far too shallow to dive safely. If they submerged now, they would be a sitting duck on the bottom, unable to maneuver. They had to run on the surface, exposed and vulnerable, racing toward the deep water of the open sea. On the shore, chaos reigned. Searchlights from nearby military garrisons snapped on, their pale beams sweeping the ocean frantically. They were looking for a boat, a plane, anything to explain the devastation on the tracks. The beams sliced through the darkness, swinging wildly. One beam swept directly over the Barb's wake, missing the submarine by mere yards. Fluckey watched the dance of lights through the periscope, his heart hammering against his ribs. He maneuvered the boat like a sports car, zigzagging through the uncharted shallows, dodging the probing fingers of light. The depth gauge crept up agonizingly slowly. 6 fathoms. 7 fathoms. They were racing against the reaction time of the Japanese coastal artillery. If a battery commander spotted the low silhouette of the sub against the burning backdrop of the train, a 5-inch shell could end the Barb's career in an instant. For an hour, they ran the gauntlet, the glow of the burning train slowly fading astern, a smoldering testament to the audacity of the galloping ghost of the China coast. Finally, the bottom dropped away. The fathometer read deep water. "Clear the bridge! Dive! Dive!" The klaxon hooted, and the Barb slipped beneath the waves, vanishing into the cold, crushing safety of the deep. They were gone. The celebration aboard the boat was muted but intense. There were no shouts, just grim smiles and handshakes. They had twisted the tiger's tail and walked away without a scratch. Hatfield, the electrician who had engineered the device, became an instant legend, the man who proved that a pickle jar could kill a train. But the war wasn't over. Fluckey, relentless as ever, continued the patrol. They had rockets left, and he intended to use them. Over the next few days, the Barb surfaced again and again, raining destruction on coastal towns, destroying a sampan building yard and shelling a canning factory. They acted with total impunity, a phantom menace that struck from the sea and disappeared before the enemy could return fire. It was psychological warfare at its finest. The Japanese High Command was forced to divert troops and resources to protect the coastline, resources that were desperately needed elsewhere. The Barb had effectively opened a new front in the war, all by herself. When the Barb finally turned her bow toward Midway and the end of her 12th war patrol, she carried a crew that was exhausted, filthy, and triumphant. They pulled into the submarine base on August 2, 1945, to a hero's welcome. But the true symbol of their victory wasn't the cheering crowds or the brass band. It was their battle flag. Submarine battle flags were the unofficial resumes of the boats, adorned with symbols of ships sunk, merchant flags for tankers, rising suns for warships. The Barb's flag was already crowded with symbols, a testament to her lethal career. But at the bottom center, prominently displayed, the crew had stitched a new, unprecedented icon, the silhouette of a steam locomotive. It was an image that baffled inspecting officers. "You sank a what?" they would ask. And the crew would grin and say, "We didn't sink it, sir. We blew it to hell." Admiral Chester Nimitz, the commander-in-chief of the Pacific Fleet, looked at the flag and shook his head in disbelief. He had heard the reports, but seeing the train on the battle flag made it real. The audacity of Fluckey and his men had rewritten the rulebook of submarine warfare. The war ended just 2 weeks later. The atomic bombs fell, the Emperor surrendered, and the guns fell silent. The Barb's train mission became the final exclamation point on the submarine campaign in the Pacific. But the story of the Barb didn't end with the surrender. The boat that had defied death a dozen times faced a new, slower enemy: obsolescence. In the post-war years, she was decommissioned, then recommissioned, used for training, and eventually considered surplus to requirements. In a twist of fate that felt like a betrayal to her crew, the Navy lent the Barb to the Italian Navy in 1954. She was renamed the Enrico Tazzoli, and for nearly 20 years, the submarine that had terrorized the Japanese coast served under a foreign flag. In 1972, the Italians finally decided she was too old to maintain. They sold her for scrap. The news that the USS Barb was being cut up for razor blades hit the crew hard. Fluckey, who had by then risen to the rank of Rear Admiral, tried to organize an effort to save her. He and the surviving crew members pooled their money, desperate to buy their old boat back and bring her home as a museum ship. They wanted to park her in a place of honor, a memorial to the 8 men who paddled ashore and the 72 who waited for them. But they were too late. By the time they secured the funds and the permissions, the torchmen in the Italian scrapyard had already done their work. The pressure hull that had withstood depth charges and typhoons was sliced apart. The deck where they had launched rockets was melted down. The Enrico Tazzoli was gone, and with her, the physical shell of the USS Barb. The only piece of her that survived was the battle flag, which eventually found its resting place in the Submarine Force Library and Museum in Groton, Connecticut. It hangs there today, a piece of fabric that tells a story no screenwriter would dare invent. Gene Fluckey retired from the Navy as one of the most decorated officers in its history. He wore the Medal of Honor, 4 Navy Crosses, and a chest full of campaign ribbons. But in his later years, when he wrote his memoirs and spoke to historians, he rarely boasted about the tonnage he sunk or the strategic brilliance of his attacks. He spoke about the men. He spoke about Paul Saunders, the chief gunner's mate who led the shore party. He spoke about Billy Hatfield, the former railroad worker who remembered a prank with walnuts. He spoke about the trust that existed in that steel tube, a bond so absolute that 80 men volunteered for a suicide mission because their captain asked them to. Fluckey passed away in 2007 at the age of 93, taking his place in the pantheon of naval legends. But his proudest statistic, the one he repeated to anyone who would listen, was not the number of ships he destroyed. It was the number of Purple Hearts he awarded. 0. In 5 brutal war patrols, through minefields, gun battles, and the daring raid on Karafuto, Eugene Fluckey never lost a man. He brought them all home. The story of the USS Barb is more than a war story. It is a testament to American ingenuity and the refusal to accept the impossible. It is the story of a commander who looked at a coastline and saw a target where others saw a boundary. It is the story of sailors who reinvented their ship on the fly, turning a submersible torpedo boat into a rocket-launching, train-killing destroyer. And somewhere in the dark, cold waters off the coast of Sakhalin Island, if you listen closely to the echoes of history, you can still hear the phantom rumble of a diesel engine, the splash of paddles in the surf, and the distant, thunderous roar of a steam locomotive meeting its end at the hands of the Pickle Jar bomb. The Barb is gone, but the legend of the train that died at sea will never sink.